A black doctor saves the life of a racist white woman who wakes up furious and demands to see a real doctor, not realizing her life is in the hands of the very person she despises. The flashing red and blue lights danced across the emergency room entrance as paramedics rushed in, wheeling in a woman with graying hair and an air of affluence despite her disheveled state. Dr. Maya Caldwell, a black physician well regarded for her surgical precision and unbreakable calm under pressure, stood ready at the ER doors, steeling herself as she did with every new patient. Maya was a presence at St. Mary's, her reputation as both an excellent doctor and a compassionate caregiver earning her respect from both staff and patients. Dr. Caldwell, this one's critical, said one of the nurses, guiding her to the stretcher where the woman lay. She was in a bad accident, severe internal bleeding, broken ribs, possible spinal injuries. We need you now. Without missing a beat, Maya jumped into action. She gently touched the woman's shoulder, trying to establish the faintest thread of a connection. Ma'am, you're in good hands. My name is Dr. Caldwell, and I'm here to help you. The woman, whose face was contorted in both pain and shock, glanced up with glazed eyes that slowly sharpened. The moment her gaze locked onto Maya's dark brown skin, her expression shifted from pain to something far uglier. Get your hands off me, the woman spat, her voice weak but laced with unmistakable venom. I don't want, she winced, a grimace of pain twisting her features. I don't want you. Get me a real doctor. Maya paused for just a moment, steadying herself against the hostility flaring from this injured woman, then leaned back slightly. Mrs. Armstrong, I am the attending physician. If you don't let me help you, your injuries could worsen. Please trust me on this. But the woman shook her head, her gaze darting to one of the nearby nurses, as if seeking someone, anyone, other than Maya to take over. I don't want her treating me, she snapped, voice trembling, but her injuries made her protest feeble. The nurse looked at Dr. Caldwell with a knowing expression, clearly uncomfortable but unwavering in her support of her superior. Dr. Caldwell is the best ER doctor we have, Mrs. Armstrong, she said gently. She's here to help. Linda Armstrong glared defiantly, muttering under her breath. I won't be treated by someone like her. I have rights. But Maya was already refocusing, her face expressionless and composed. Years in her field had taught her to face every challenge, and this was no different. Racist patients weren't new, but the vitriol in this woman's gaze burned with an intensity that Maya hadn't felt in a while. But she was here to save lives, not argue. Her vow as a doctor demanded her dedication, even to patients like Mrs. Armstrong. All right, Mrs. Armstrong, we're going to stabilize you now, Maya said with authority, her tone gentle but firm. Let's get you prepped for surgery. You're in critical condition, and there's no time to lose. As they wheeled her into the operating room, Mrs. Armstrong continued her litany of barely contained insults and complaints. Maya heard it all. I'm not a guinea pig for some, and these standards have gone down if they're letting people like you. But Maya shut out the noise, letting her professionalism and empathy guide her. This woman's hate wouldn't shake her focus. She quickly examined the scan results and identified where Linda was bleeding internally. Time was ticking, and Maya's mind switched to autopilot, mentally reviewing her surgical plan. As the surgery progressed, Maya's skill shone. Hours went by as she worked meticulously, repairing Linda's damaged spleen, realigning ribs, and ensuring there would be minimal long-term damage. Her team followed her every instruction without a hitch, their trust in her abilities absolute. And by the time they finished, Mrs. Armstrong was out of immediate danger, resting in the recovery ward. Back in the locker room after her shift, Maya felt a surge of exhaustion mixed with frustration. Her mind replayed Mrs. Armstrong's words, all the racist venom, the contempt. It lingered, like a foul taste she couldn't shake. She vented to one of her close friends and fellow doctor, Dr. Aaliyah Thompson, a black woman who had been her support through many such ordeals. People like her don't deserve doctors like you, Aaliyah muttered, crossing her arms. Honestly, I'd have let her demand someone else and waited. Maya shook her head, giving a small, weary smile. Aaliyah, we've all taken that oath. That's what separates us from people like her. We do what's right, not what's easy. Still, it takes a special kind of strength to stay professional through that, Aaliyah replied, admiration evident. But watch out. If she's that vocal about her feelings, she might try to stir trouble. Maya nodded, already bracing herself for what the next few days could bring. The following morning, Mrs. Armstrong awoke in her hospital room, her face scrunched in distaste as she glanced around, clearly displeased with her surroundings. She shifted in bed, wincing in pain, but her displeasure only deepened as she took in the monitors and IVs attached to her. Just then, Maya walked in, clipboard in hand, as calm and professional as ever. "Good morning, Mrs. Armstrong," she said, her voice steady. "I'm Dr. Caldwell. You had a difficult surgery, but we were able to stabilize you, and you're now on the path to recovery." Linda's face twisted in shock and anger, and she sneered. "You're my doctor?" she almost shouted, the anger brightening her eyes. "What did I say yesterday? I don't want your help. I'm filing a complaint. This is unacceptable." Maya remained composed, though she felt a pang of frustration tightening in her chest. "Mrs. Armstrong, I understand you may feel uncomfortable, but my team and I did everything possible to ensure you received the best care. Your life was at risk." Linda waved her off, her voice laced with malice. "I don't care what you think you did. I'll be talking to the administration. They'll know how unprofessional it is for you to be in charge of someone like me." Just then, Linda's family walked in, her 2 grown daughters and a teenage granddaughter who looked visibly taken aback by her outburst. One of her daughters, a woman named Emily, looked between her mother and Dr. Caldwell with evident embarrassment. "Mom, Dr. Caldwell saved your life," Emily said, her voice low but firm. "Can't you be a little grateful?" "Grateful?" Linda scoffed. "You think I should thank her?" She fixed Maya with a cold glare. "I'd rather have died than have her as my doctor." Maya felt each word, each ounce of hostility, but she maintained her poise. "If you have any specific complaints, Mrs. Armstrong, you are free to take them to administration. I'm here to help you recover, nothing more." With that, Maya excused herself, leaving Linda fuming and her family in a tense silence. Maya returned to her office, hoping that would be the end of it. She had seen patients who didn't appreciate her because of her skin color before, but Linda Armstrong's hatred was visceral, and it left her unsettled. However, later that afternoon, Maya's worst fears were realized. She was called into the hospital director's office for an urgent matter regarding a complaint. Mrs. Armstrong had indeed filed a formal grievance, accusing Maya of misconduct and even negligence, claiming that her treatment had been unacceptable and untrustworthy. The hospital director, Dr. Stevens, met Maya with a neutral expression, but she sensed the unease in his gaze. "Maya, I'm aware of your record and the quality of your work," he began. "But this patient's family is a longtime supporter of the hospital. There are already whispers circulating, and I wanted to make sure you were aware of how this might play out." Maya took a steadying breath, bracing herself for the ordeal she knew was coming. Mrs. Armstrong wasn't about to let this go. And as she prepared for the next steps, Maya understood she'd have to confront more than just the whispers. She was about to go head to head with the power of a woman set on destroying her, simply because of who she was. Dr. Maya Caldwell stood in the hospital director's office, processing the magnitude of Linda Armstrong's vendetta. She could handle patients' misplaced anger, but Linda's malice felt like a different beast altogether. She'd only encountered such hostility a handful of times, and it never became easier. Linda's accusations were beyond hurtful. They were designed to undermine everything Maya had worked for. "Maya," Dr. Stevens began, his tone softer now, "I know the complaint is unfounded. Your record speaks for itself. Years of exemplary work, patient testimonials, commendations. I've never had cause to doubt you." Maya nodded, grateful for his words. "Thank you, Dr. Stevens. I want to be clear that I did everything in my power to help her. She would have died without surgery." "I believe you," he assured her. "However, the Armstrong family holds a lot of influence here. If she escalates this publicly, it could reflect poorly on the hospital. For now, I'll handle this internally, but be prepared. If Linda takes this to the media, it might become a bigger issue than any of us want." Maya understood. As infuriating as it was, she knew the hospital had its image to protect, especially with donors as influential as the Armstrong family. Despite her frustration, she kept her response professional. "I'll stay available for any meetings or inquiries," Maya said, keeping her voice steady. "And if there's anything else I need to know, please let me know." Dr. Stevens nodded. "We'll support you, Maya. You're one of our best doctors, and we're not going to let an unfounded accusation ruin that." She left his office with mixed feelings. The support from Dr. Stevens reassured her, but she knew Linda's next steps would be ruthless. That evening, as Maya reviewed patient charts in her office, a few nurses dropped in with concerned expressions. Among them was Nurse Ramirez, who had been in the ER with Maya during Linda's initial arrival. "Dr. Caldwell, I heard about the complaint Mrs. Armstrong filed," Ramirez said, a frown creasing her forehead. "Are you doing okay?" Maya nodded, though the exhaustion was starting to catch up with her. It's not the first time something like this has happened, but it's intense. Nurse Ramirez leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. You shouldn't have to deal with this. Everyone who was in that OR saw the incredible job you did, and we're all on your side, but you should know, Mrs. Armstrong has been talking to anyone who will listen, even trying to gather statements from other patients. Maya sighed, feeling the weight of the situation grow. Thank you for telling me. It's clear she's not going to back down easily. Ramirez shook her head. If it helps, we're with you, Dr. Caldwell. I can't believe she's going to such lengths after you saved her life. It's disgusting. Maya gave her a small smile of appreciation. I'm just focusing on my work. If she wants to complain, let her. I know what I did was right. As her shift ended, Maya left the hospital with a sense of apprehension hanging over her. She tried to shake it off, but her mind kept replaying Linda's words. That night, sleep was elusive. The next morning, Maya arrived to find a note on her desk, summoning her to a meeting with the hospital administration at noon. She expected the complaint to escalate, but this was sooner than she'd anticipated. Her stomach twisted with anxiety, though she knew she'd done nothing wrong. When she entered the conference room, Linda was already there with her lawyer, a steely-eyed woman in a sharp suit. The hospital's legal counsel, Dr. Stevens, and two board members sat at the far end of the table. Linda's face contorted with thinly veiled disgust as Maya entered, and she muttered something under her breath. Maya ignored her, taking a seat opposite Linda, who immediately launched into her accusations. This doctor, Linda began, her tone dripping with contempt, should not be allowed to practice medicine. She put my life at risk. Her attitude was unacceptable, and her so-called treatment was invasive. I don't know if this is the new standard here, but I refuse to be subjected to such inadequacy. Maya clenched her jaw, maintaining a calm, steady gaze. She could feel Linda's hatred like a physical force, but she wasn't about to let it undermine her confidence. Dr. Stevens spoke up. Mrs. Armstrong, Dr. Caldwell performed a highly skilled and life-saving surgery on you. You arrived in critical condition, and we were fortunate to have someone of her caliber on staff. Linda scoffed, rolling her eyes. Oh, I'm sure you'd say that. But let me ask you this. Why didn't anyone offer me a choice? Why was I forced to have her operate on me? The lawyer chimed in, backing Linda's complaints with assertions about patient autonomy and proper protocol. The implication was clear. Linda wanted to paint this as a violation of her rights, turning her personal disdain into a supposed medical grievance. Maya listened, feeling a deep sense of frustration. When it was her turn to speak, she chose her words carefully. Mrs. Armstrong, when you arrived in the ER, you were in critical condition with severe internal injuries. You needed immediate surgery or you would have died. I did everything within my medical duty to ensure you had the best possible care, and I stand by every decision I made in that operating room. Linda's face twisted and she snapped. I don't believe a word of it. You can say whatever you want, but I don't trust you and I want the hospital to know that. She turned to Dr. Stevens. I won't let this go until this so-called doctor is held accountable. The board members exchanged glances, and Maya felt a flare of resentment at their hesitation. She knew that hesitation too well. It was the fear of backlash, of losing the Armstrong family's support. But Maya wasn't going to apologize for saving a life, even if Linda wanted her to. Dr. Stevens cleared his throat. Mrs. Armstrong, we've reviewed Dr. Caldwell's record, and we're confident in her skills and her professionalism. However, we understand you have concerns, and we will address them with utmost seriousness. Dr. Caldwell will remain on duty, and will conduct a thorough review just to ensure all protocols were followed. Linda's face fell in visible disappointment. She'd expected a more punitive result, but she wasn't finished yet. This isn't over, Linda said, standing up abruptly. She threw one last withering look at Maya. If you think I'm backing down, you're sorely mistaken. Days went by, and Linda Armstrong's complaint made its rounds throughout the hospital. Most staff knew Dr. Caldwell and supported her, but some couldn't help but wonder how far Linda was willing to go. Tension permeated the halls, and Maya noticed a slight shift in how some of her patients viewed her, as if they, too, were questioning her competency based on Linda's influence. Despite the challenges, Maya continued her work, maintaining her high standards with every patient. She didn't have the luxury to worry about Linda's campaign against her during her shifts, but it was a cloud that loomed large outside of work hours. Then, one morning, while making her rounds, Maya passed by a group of reporters gathered near the entrance. She froze for a moment, recognizing a familiar face among them, Linda's lawyer, who was giving an animated interview. Maya couldn't hear the words, but the expressions of shock and disapproval on the faces of onlookers were telling. The story had leaked to the media. That afternoon, Maya sat in her office, phone in hand, reading the headlines on her screen. Prominent patient claims doctor endangered her life. One article blared, accompanied by a grainy photograph of Linda looking frail and pained, her arm in a sling and her eyes full of anger. The articles described her harrowing account, framing her experience as a horrifying ordeal that brought into question the practices at St. Mary's Hospital. Maya's heart sank, not just for herself, but for the hospital. She knew the story would damage the hospital's reputation, perhaps as much as her own, and that was exactly what Linda wanted. As if on cue, her phone rang. It was Dr. Stevens. "Maya," he said, his voice tense, "we need to address this. We're organizing a press conference tomorrow to clear the air. I'll be handling most of the statements, but I want you there to represent yourself." Maya agreed, feeling a mix of dread and determination. She'd worked hard to build her career, and she wasn't about to let someone like Linda Armstrong tear it down. The following day, the press conference was held in one of the hospital's larger conference rooms. Cameras flashed as Maya, Dr. Stevens, and the hospital's PR team took their places at the front. Reporters were lined up, pens poised, ready to capture every word. Dr. Stevens started, addressing the hospital's commitment to patient care and the unwavering dedication of their staff, particularly Dr. Caldwell, whose record of success was stellar. When it was Maya's turn to speak, she stepped up to the podium, meeting the gaze of every reporter in the room. Her voice was steady as she began. "I'm Dr. Maya Caldwell. I've dedicated my career to helping people, no matter their background, beliefs, or feelings toward me. My sole focus in the operating room is saving lives. Mrs. Armstrong's surgery was no different." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I understand that Mrs. Armstrong feels she wasn't given a choice in her care, but when a life is on the line, the medical team's duty is to act swiftly to save that life. I treated Mrs. Armstrong with the same care and dedication I would offer any patient. It was my duty, and it is a duty I take seriously." One of the reporters raised a hand, his tone skeptical. "Dr. Caldwell, Mrs. Armstrong claims your treatment was subpar and even dangerous. How do you respond to that?" Maya met his gaze. "The surgery was successful, and Mrs. Armstrong is alive and recovering because of it. Every step I took was to ensure her safety and recovery. I don't believe any patient should have to question their doctor's dedication based on anything other than their ability to save lives." Another reporter chimed in. "Mrs. Armstrong has also implied that there was negligence. Do you deny those claims?" Maya's voice remained calm. "I do deny them. Every action I took was in line with the highest standards of medical care. The hospital has conducted a full review and found no negligence." After the press conference, Maya felt a sense of catharsis. The public might still be divided, but she stood up for herself and her principles. That night, she finally slept soundly, no longer weighed down by the pressure of Linda's vendetta. In the weeks that followed, support for Maya poured in from colleagues, patients, and even strangers who read her story. Her social media inbox filled with messages of encouragement, with many people sharing their gratitude for doctors like her. Linda Armstrong eventually settled her complaint with the hospital, no doubt recognizing that public opinion wasn't on her side. Her fury remained palpable, but her influence had waned. Maya continued her work with renewed strength, knowing she'd faced one of the hardest battles of her career and emerged with her integrity intact. And as for Linda, she left the hospital bitter and unreconciled, her vendetta diminished but not forgotten. But Maya didn't look back. Her focus remained on the patients who came through the ER doors each day, each one receiving the full measure of her skill and dedication, no matter who they were or what they believed. Despite the press conference and the hospital's official statements supporting Dr. Maya Caldwell, Linda Armstrong was far from satisfied. The woman was relentless, digging her heels into her complaint, her bitterness more fervent than ever. She became determined to go beyond the hospital's channels, escalating her campaign to the public. Linda's next move was calculated. She began reaching out to every media contact she could find, insisting her story be covered, describing herself as a victim of negligence. She contacted local news outlets, posted on community forums, and even tried to hire a PR representative to spread her narrative, sparing no expense in her quest to ruin Dr. Caldwell. Her claims grew wilder with each retelling, until the original story was almost unrecognizable. Maya, according to Linda, had put her at unnecessary risk, and her incompetence had been downplayed by a biased hospital administration. Meanwhile, the hospital administration took its own steps to resolve Linda's complaint, knowing her family's influence carried significant weight. Although Dr. Stevens and many of the senior staff supported Maya, the hospital's board of trustees worried about potential donor relations and public perception. Reluctantly, They initiated a formal review of Maya's medical history and her treatment of Linda Armstrong, hoping to reassure Linda and anyone following the story in the media that they were taking every complaint seriously. Despite the scrutiny, Maya remained calm. She knew her record was clean, built on years of impeccable service and dedication. If they wanted to investigate her, she welcomed it, confident they would find no wrongdoing. Her work was above reproach. Still, it was challenging to ignore Linda's escalating accusations, now amplified by local blogs and social media accounts. Linda's inflammatory comments and accusations even found their way to Maya's professional pages, where strangers left disparaging comments based on Linda's claims. The strain was mounting, but Maya continued her work, maintaining her poise through the pressure. The hospital's formal review was thorough. Over several weeks, the administrators combed through every detail of Maya's career, looking at patient outcomes, reviews, peer evaluations, and procedural adherence. Maya's colleagues were interviewed, her work ethic scrutinized, and every case she had worked on was examined to uncover even a shred of fault. Linda's complaint had been the trigger, but this investigation would be exhaustive. Throughout this period, Maya continued to face Linda's ire in unexpected ways. Even though she'd blocked Linda's personal numbers and social media accounts, Linda somehow managed to find new channels, sending messages full of insults and veiled threats. Each day seemed to bring fresh harassment, a relentless reminder of Linda's obsession with Maya's downfall. But as the hospital's review progressed, signs of Linda's own flaws began to leak out. A nurse who had been in the ER on the night of Linda's surgery had been asked for a statement as part of the investigation, and what she described painted Linda in a far different light than the public image Linda was trying to craft. The nurse recounted how Linda had berated Maya's surgical team, making a string of derogatory remarks. Linda had spoken openly about her distrust of having a doctor like that operate on her. It was a shocking level of hostility, and the story started to gain attention. One night, Linda had an encounter that would become the turning point in the entire ordeal. She'd gone to a popular cafe in her affluent neighborhood and had, as usual, complained loudly about the disgraceful treatment she'd received from Maya, unaware of who was listening. The people seated nearby overheard Linda's outburst, her words laced with racial slurs and venom. It didn't take long for someone to whip out a phone and capture the exchange. The video went viral within hours. In it, Linda was seen spewing hate, her face twisted with contempt as she described Maya's audacity and blamed her for every imagined slight. The recording captured Linda's blatant racism, her remarks about not wanting one of them touching her, and demanding that the hospital rid itself of incompetent staff like her. The video was shared widely, and Linda's words sparked outrage, even among some of her staunchest allies. The reaction was swift. Linda Armstrong was thrust into the spotlight as a poster child for bigotry. Social media users voiced their disgust, with hundreds of comments condemning her behavior and calling for her to be held accountable for her words. The backlash spread across platforms, and people from all walks of life united in calling her out. Many shared personal stories of discrimination they'd faced, adding to the mounting outrage. News networks that had previously expressed interest in Linda's side of the story began to backpedal, pulling down articles that had portrayed her sympathetically. Some journalists publicly apologized for publishing her story without doing more investigation. Community organizations that Linda's family had long supported distanced themselves, issuing statements condemning her remarks. The video didn't just spark condemnation, it also drew praise for Dr. Caldwell, who had remained professional and focused on saving lives despite Linda's attacks. The truth about Linda's hostility painted Maya as an even more commendable figure, the kind of doctor who would put her duty above personal biases and who had endured extraordinary abuse with grace and resilience. People across social media platforms rallied around Maya, sharing messages of gratitude, solidarity, and admiration for her unwavering professionalism. The hospital administration noticed the shifting public sentiment. Board members who had previously shown concern about donor reactions found themselves inundated with emails and calls from community members urging them to stand by Dr. Caldwell. The hospital's media team began fielding inquiries about Maya's career and commitment to her patients. Seeing an opportunity, Dr. Stevens and a few of Maya's allies within the administration proposed something unprecedented, recognizing Maya's dedication to her patients with a commendation. The decision was unanimous. The following week, Maya received an email from Dr. Stevens, inviting her to a special recognition ceremony organized by the hospital. When she arrived, she found a small, supportive crowd of colleagues and hospital staff waiting for her. Dr. Stevens began the ceremony by addressing the audience. "Today," he announced, "we're gathered to honor Dr. Maya Caldwell, whose dedication, skill, and unwavering professionalism have set a standard for us all. Despite facing challenges that would test anyone's patience, Dr. Caldwell has remained focused on what she does best, saving lives. It's our privilege to recognize her contributions today. He presented her with a plaque of commendation, and the room erupted into applause. Maya felt a mix of emotions as she accepted it: relief, gratitude, and a profound sense of validation. She looked out at the crowd, meeting the eyes of her colleagues, who beamed with pride. It was a moment of triumph, one she knew she'd never forget. As she left the ceremony, Maya was met with heartfelt congratulations from doctors, nurses, and staff members alike. Many of them shared their own words of support, reaffirming their admiration for her dedication and resilience. She was overwhelmed by their kindness and their belief in her. The fallout for Linda Armstrong continued. The video of her racist tirade spread beyond social media, covered by major news networks, each condemning her bigoted remarks. Public sentiment turned sharply against her, and she became a pariah in her own community. Longtime friends distanced themselves, uncomfortable with her exposed behavior, and her involvement with several local organizations was terminated. The consequences extended beyond her social circle. Her family's business suffered as clients and partners withdrew, unwilling to associate with someone so openly racist. In the wake of the backlash, Linda tried to issue an apology, but it came off as disingenuous. Public opinion didn't sway, and the apology only served to make her actions seem all the more hollow. The community Linda had once used to bolster her influence now viewed her with disgust, seeing her not as the victim she tried to portray, but as the antagonist in her own story. With each passing day, it became clear to Linda that she'd lost not only her credibility, but the respect of everyone around her. Her efforts to ruin Dr. Caldwell's reputation had backfired spectacularly, leaving her isolated and disgraced. Maya resumed her work, the ordeal with Linda now a closed chapter. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, buoyed by the support she'd received from her colleagues and the community. The incident had strengthened her resolve, reminding her of why she had chosen this path. Her reputation as a skilled and compassionate doctor was stronger than ever, and she continued her work with the same dedication she'd always brought to her patients. One day, she received a handwritten letter from a former patient who had followed the ordeal. The letter expressed gratitude, saying, "You showed us what true courage looks like. Thank you for standing tall and doing what was right." Maya kept the letter on her desk, a quiet reminder of her journey. She had faced down prejudice and hatred, and in the end, it was her integrity and professionalism that had won out. Her reputation was untarnished, strengthened even, and she was reminded of the countless lives she still had to impact. And somewhere, Linda Armstrong had to live with the consequences of her actions, knowing that her own bigotry had brought about her downfall.